Sometimes the deepest cold comes not from winter, but from being forgotten by the world. When death takes the one person who mattered most, even breathing becomes a burden too heavy to bear. Outside the village of Skarnholt, widow Brynhild sits on her broken doorstep. Her husband died in the raids. Her roof leaks. Her firewood is gone. No one comes anymore. She waits barefoot in the snow, ready to give up. Then she hears footsteps. A giant warrior named Eirik stands before her. He sees her pain and says 4 words, "Come home with me." The villagers watch as he lifts her gently. What this feared Viking does next changes everything. He rebuilds her hearth. He shares his food. He listens to her stories. Not from pity, but respect. But why would a legendary warrior risk everything for a forgotten widow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Skarnholt had always been a place where winter arrived early and stayed late, where the sea crashed against black rocks with a violence that reminded everyone that survival was never guaranteed. Built on a windswept peninsula where the North Sea met jagged cliffs, it was home to fishermen, farmers, and warriors who understood that life was measured not in years, but in storms weathered. Brynhild, Eirik's daughter, had known this truth longer than most. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned that grief was not something to overcome, but something to carry with grace. Her auburn hair, streaked now with premature silver, was always braided simply and pinned back from a face that bore the weathered beauty of someone who had looked directly into hardship without flinching. Had been married to Gunnar Thorsen for 15 years, a good man, a steady fisherman who brought home enough to keep them comfortable in their small wooden house at the village's edge. Their home sat on a gentle rise overlooking the harbor, with a view of the boats coming and going that had once filled her with contentment. They had tried for children, prayed for them, hoped for them, but the gods had different plans. Instead of little voices filling their halls, they had filled them with laughter between themselves, with Gunnar's stories of the sea, with Brynhild's skill at weaving and her small herb garden that somehow flourished despite the harsh climate. The raids had come in late summer, as they often did. Norse warriors from the eastern settlements, hungry for silver and slaves, had swept down the coast like a plague. Most of Skarnholt's men had gone to defend the neighboring village of Nordvik, where the raiders had been spotted first. Gunnar among them, his fishing spear traded for a proper warrior's axe, his gentle hands gripping weapons of war. They never came back. Word had trickled in over the following week's fragments of the battle, names of the fallen, descriptions of how bravely they had fought. Gunnar had died protecting the children who had hidden in Nordvik's grain storehouse. He had stood against 3 raiders and bought enough time for the little ones to escape through a back passage. He died as he had lived, thinking of others before himself. That was 4 months ago. 4 months of Brynhild learning what it meant to be truly alone. At first, the village had rallied around her. Gunnar had been well liked, and Brynhild had always been generous with her healing herbs when someone took ill. The village women brought her stew and bread. The men repaired her roof and chopped firewood. Old Thormund, the village elder, had even suggested that she might find comfort in the household of his brother's family, where she could help with the children and earn her keep. But charity has a way of growing thin. When winter deepens and everyone's stores run low, the visits became less frequent. The repairs went undone. The firewood dwindled. Brynhild understood she had been the wife of a fisherman, not a warrior. She had no sons to offer the village, no particular skills that couldn't be found elsewhere. She was simply another mouth to feed in a place where food was precious. So she had learned to make do with less. She mended her roof as best she could with scraps of wood and tar. She gathered what firewood she could find, mostly driftwood from the shore that burned poorly, and filled her small house with bitter smoke. She ate 1 meal a day, sometimes less, stretching her meager stores of dried fish and barley. But it was more than physical hunger that was consuming her. It was the silence. The way conversation stopped when she entered the market square. The way children, who had once run to her for treats and stories, now looked away. The way even the village dogs seemed to sense her diminished status and no longer came to her door looking for scraps. This morning had been the worst yet. She had awakened to find frost covering the inside of her windows and her water barrel frozen solid. The last of her firewood was gone, burned during the night in a desperate attempt to keep warm. Her stores of food consisted of a handful of barley and a piece of dried fish, so hard it could have been used for kindling. She had sat on her doorstep because she could not bear to stay inside the cold, empty house any longer. The wooden steps, worn smooth by years of Gunnar's boots coming and going, seemed like the only place where she could still feel connected to the life she had lost, even though snow soaked through her thin dress and numbed her bare feet. Even though her breath came in small clouds that dissipated as quickly as her hopes. She stayed. That was when she heard the footsteps. They weren't the light, hurried steps of a villager going about their business. These were heavy, deliberate, the sound of someone who moved with purpose and power. Brynhild looked up through her frost-dimmed eyes and saw a figure approaching through the morning. Missed a man so large he seemed to block out the pale winter sun. Eirik Ironburn stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and arms thick as shipmasts. His beard was black streaked with iron gray, braided with small metal rings that caught what little light filtered through the clouds. Scars crisscrossed his visible skin, some old and silver, others newer and still pink, telling stories of battles fought and survived. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when they settled on Brynhild, they held a depth of understanding that surprised her. He wore a heavy woolen cloak over leather and mail, and his boots were well-made and waterproofed. Everything about him spoke of a man who had the means to stay warm, well-fed, and protected. More than that, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to command, to having his words listened to and obeyed. But it was not his size or his obvious wealth that struck Brynhild most forcefully. It was the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with the uncomfortable mixture of sympathy and relief that marked the gazes of her neighbors, those looks that said, "There but for fortune go I." Instead, Eirik looked at her with recognition, as if he saw not just her current misery, but the woman she had been, the strength she still carried, the worth that others had forgotten. "Come home with me," he said, his voice deep and quiet, carrying easily over the wind. 4 words. Simple words, but in them, Brynhild heard something she had almost forgotten existed. An invitation not based on charity or obligation, but on choice. He was not offering to help her. He was offering to share with her. There was a world of difference between the two. Around them, the village began to take notice. Astrid, the blacksmith's wife, peered out from behind her door. Young Bjorn stopped his morning chores to stare. Old Thormund emerged from his hall, his expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching alarm. Eirik Ironburn was not unknown in Skarnholt, though his visits were rare. He was a warrior of considerable reputation, a man who had traveled to the edges of the known world and returned with silver, stories, and scars. He owned a large farmstead in the hills above the village, worked by thralls and free men who respected him for his fair dealing and feared him for his skill with blade and axe. He was unmarried, had been married once, years ago, to a woman who died bearing his child, a child who died with her. Since then, he had lived alone in his great wooden hall, emerging occasionally to trade or to answer calls for warriors when raids threatened. He was respected, even admired, but he was not part of the village's daily life. He was too wealthy, too independent, too much his own man to be drawn into the small politics and petty concerns that occupied most of their neighbors. which made his presence here, now, offering aid to the village's most forgotten member, all the more shocking. Brynhild felt the weight of watching eyes as Eirik extended his hand to her. She understood that accepting his offer would change everything. Not just for her, but for how the village saw her. Some would whisper that she was trading on feminine wiles to secure comfort. Others might suggest that her grief had made her desperate enough to accept any offer, no matter how inappropriate. But as she looked into Eirik's storm-gray eyes, she realized she no longer cared what the village thought. They had already forgotten her, already decided she was a burden, a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn. Their opinions had become as cold and empty as her house. "Yes," she said. Placing her hand in his dot, his fingers were warm, calloused from work and weapons, but gentle as he helped her to her feet. She swayed slightly. She had been sitting in the cold too long, had eaten too little for too many days, but his other hand steadied her with careful strength. "My thanks," she said, looking back at the house. "What do you need?" he asked. Brynhild considered this question. What did she need? Her few remaining clothes, patched and mended. Her mother's silver brooch, the only thing of value she possessed. The wooden comb Gunnar had carved for her during their first winter together. Her small loom and the half-finished weaving still strung upon it. "Very little," she said finally. Eirik nodded as if this answer pleased him. "I'll wait." She gathered her meager possessions quickly, aware that the entire village was now watching. As she emerged from the house with a small bundle in her arms, she caught sight of their faces, some disapproving, some envious, all curious about what would happen next. Eirik took her bundle without being asked and secured it to his horse, a large bay stallion that stamped impatiently in the cold. Then he lifted Brynhild onto the horse as if she weighed nothing at all, settling her behind the saddle with the same care he had shown for her possessions. As they rode away from Skarnholt, Brynhild did not look back. She had spent 4 months learning that her past life was gone, as surely as if the raiders had burned it to ash. Whatever lay ahead could hardly be worse than what she was leaving behind. The ride to Eirik's farmstead took them up winding paths through hills dotted with stands of pine and birch. The air grew cleaner as they climbed, sharp with the scent of snow and evergreen. For the first time in months, Brynhild felt herself truly breathing. Behind her, the village of Skarnholt grew smaller and more distant, until it disappeared entirely behind the curves of the hillside. Eirik's farmstead spread across a sheltered valley like a miniature kingdom. The main hall rose from the landscape with the solid permanence of something built to last. Generations thick timber walls chinked with clay and moss. A roof of overlapping wooden shingles weathered silver gray by countless seasons. Smoke rose steadily from the central hearth, promising warmth within. Surrounding the hall, other buildings dotted the landscape with purposeful arrangement. A stable large enough for a dozen horses. Grain storages raised on stone foundations to keep rats at bay. A smithy where the ring of hammer on iron sang even now in the afternoon air. Workshops for weaving, woodworking, and leather craft. Everything spoke of prosperity earned through careful planning and hard work. Brynhild felt overwhelmed by the scale of it all. Her entire house in Skarnholt could have fit inside Eirik's stable. As he helped her down from the horse, she became acutely aware of her patched dress, her worn shoes, the way her hair had escaped its braid during the ride. She was a beggar brought to a palace. "Ingrid," Eirik called toward the hall. A woman emerged middle-aged, gray-haired, with the comfortable authority of someone who had managed households for decades. Her clothes were well-made but practical, her hands stained with flour and herbs. She looked from Eirik to Brynhild with calm assessment, showing no surprise at finding her master returning with an unexpected guest. "This is Brynhild," Eirik said simply. "She'll be staying with us." Ingrid nodded once, as if warriors bringing home widows was a common occurrence. "The blue chamber is prepared, my lord." "Shall I draw water for washing?" Please. Eirik turned to Brynhild. Ingrid manages the household. Whatever you need, ask her. Before Brynhild could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the smithy. Voices raised in anger, the clash of metal against metal, but not the rhythmic sound of hammerwork. This was the sharp, violent ring of weapons meeting. Eirik's expression hardened instantly. His hand moved to the long knife at his belt as he strode toward the noise. His earlier gentleness replaced by the bearing of a warrior who had survived countless battles. Brynhild followed, Ingrid beside her, drawn by curiosity and concern. Behind the smithy, they found two men circling each other with drawn swords. One was young, perhaps 20, with the lean build of someone still growing into his strength. The other was older, scarred, with the thick arms of someone who made his living with forge and anvil. Enough! Eirik's voice cracked like a whip across the yard. Both men froze, though they kept their weapons ready. Magnus Bjarn, Eirik said, his tone carrying deadly quiet. Explain. The younger man Magnus spoke first, his voice tight with anger. He says I'm not worthy to work his forge. Says my father was a coward who died running from raiders. The older man barn spat in the snow. Your father turned tail at the first sight of enemy shields. Everyone knows it. I won't have his blood shame pollute my workspace. Brynhild felt her breath catch. She recognized the pain in Magnus's eyes, the same helpless fury she had felt when the village began treating her as less than human. The same desperate need to prove worth in the face of others' judgment. My father died fighting, Magnus said, his sword trembling slightly. He died protecting others. He died after he ran, Bjarn countered. Found with enemy steel in his back, fleeing toward the woods. Eirik stepped between them, though neither man lowered their weapons. Bjarn, you've been my smith for 8 years. Your work is excellent. Magnus, you've been here 3 months, learning the trade. Both of you are valuable to me. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But if you cannot work together, one of you will leave. Today. The ultimatum hung in the cold air like smoke from the forge. Brynhild watched Magnus's face cycle through emotions, anger, fear, desperation. She understood his position completely. He was young, still learning his trade. If Eirik dismissed him, where would he go? What mastersmith would take on an apprentice whose father was whispered to be a coward? But she also saw Bjarn's perspective. Reputation mattered in small communities. Men lived and died by their honor, by how others saw them and their families. Working closely with someone believed to carry blood shame could taint your own standing. There's another way to settle this, Eirik said finally. Single combat. Not to death, to yielding. The winner stays. The loser leaves with silver enough for a new start elsewhere. Magnus nodded immediately, desperate eagerness replacing his earlier uncertainty. Bjarn considered longer, weighing his chances against a much younger opponent. Agreed, the smith said finally as the two men prepared for formal combat. Ingrid touched Brynhild's arm. Come, this isn't for watching. But Brynhild didn't move. She couldn't explain why, but something about Magnus's situation called to her. Perhaps it was the recognition of shared desperation. Perhaps it was simply that she had spent too many months being powerless to walk away from someone else's moment of need. The combat began with careful circling, each man testing the other's reach and reflexes. Bjarn had experience and strength, but Magnus had youth and desperation driving him. Steel rang against steel in the afternoon air, neither man gaining clear advantage. Then Bjarn landed a solid blow against Magnus's shoulder, drawing blood and a cry of pain. The young man stumbled, his guard dropping just enough for the smith to press his advantage. Within moments, Bjarn had Magnus disarmed and on his knees in the snow, sword point hovering at his throat. Yield, Bjarn commanded. Magnus looked up at him, then across the yard to where Eirik stood watching. His face was pale with more than cold, streaked with tears that might have been from pain or shame. "I yield," he whispered. Brynhild found herself stepping forward before she realized she intended to move. "Wait." Every eye turned to her. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing, heavier than the winter air. What right did she have to speak? She was a guest here, a charity case, a woman with no standing to interfere in men's business, but she spoke anyway. "You speak of Magnus's father running from battle," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "But I was there when the news came to Skarnholt. I heard what really happened." The lie came easily, flowing from her lips with surprising conviction. She had not been present when the battle reports arrived. She had been too lost in her own grief to pay attention to village gossip. But something in Magnus's desperate eyes had called to the storyteller in her, the part that had entertained Gunnar with tales during long winter nights. "Tell us," Eirik said quietly. "The raiders attacked at dawn," Brynhild continued, warming to her improvisation. "They came from two directions, main force from the south, smaller group flanking from the east. Magnus's father, Thorvald, wasn't it? Saw the trap developing. He ran not from cowardice, but to warn the defenders. He reached the eastern watchtowers just as the flanking force arrived. Fought 3 men alone while the alarm was raised. Died with enemy steel in his back because he turned to shout one final warning to his comrades." She could see Magnus's expression transforming as she spoke, hope replacing despair. Whether her story was true or not seemed less important than the fact that someone was finally offering him a version of events where his father died with honor intact. "How do you know this?" Bjorn demanded. "My husband was there," Brynhild said, the second lie coming even easier than the first. "Gunnar Thorson. He told me everything before he died. It was masterfully done. Everyone in the region knew Gunnar had died heroically defending children. His word would carry weight, and he was beyond questioning." Brynhild felt a pang of guilt for using her dead husband's reputation this way, but Magnus's needs seemed to outweigh her scruples. Eirik studied her face for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes unreadable. "And you're certain of this?" "As certain as I am of my own name." "Then the combat is ended," Eirik declared. "Magnus stays. Bjorn, you will teach him properly, without insult to his bloodline. If I hear of further discord between you, both of you leave." As the crowd dispersed and normal activity resumed around the farmstead, Eirik approached Brynhild. She expected questions about her testimony, perhaps anger at her interference. Instead, he nodded once, approval in his expression. "That was well done. You knew I was lying," she said. "Of course. But it was a good lie. One that serves justice better than truth would have." He paused, considering her with new interest. "You have a gift for seeing what people need to hear." As they walked back toward the main hall, Brynhild felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of despair that had been her constant companion for months. For the first time since Gunnar's death, she had done something that mattered. She had used her voice to help rather than simply survive, but she also recognized that her intervention had consequences. She was no longer just Eirik's charity case. She had involved herself in the life of his household, taken sides in disputes, used her growing influence with him to affect outcomes. She had made herself matter again. The question was whether she was ready for what that might bring. The blue chamber was larger than Brynhild's entire house in Skarnholt had been. A proper bed with a feather mattress dominated one wall, covered in furs and woolen blankets dyed deep indigo. A carved wooden chest sat beneath a shuttered window, and a brazier in the corner kept the space warm without filling it with smoke. On the small table beside the bed, someone had placed a bronze hand mirror polished to a bright shine and clearly expensive. Brynhild sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the soft wool of the blankets. The luxury felt almost aggressive after months of sleeping on a straw pallet under whatever scraps she could find. Everything here spoke of abundance, of someone who had never known real want. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come," she called. Ingrid entered carrying a steaming basin and clean linens. "I thought you might like to wash before the evening meal," she said, setting the basin on the chest. "There are clean clothes there as well." Brynhild looked at the garments. Ingrid indicated a dress of fine spun wool in deep green, with intricate embroidery at the neck and sleeves. Beside it lay a shift of linen so white it seemed to glow in the lamplight. "These are too fine," Brynhild protested. "I couldn't. They were made for the Lord's first wife," Ingrid said gently. "Astrid was about your size. She's been gone 7 years now. I think she would be pleased to know her things were being used to welcome another woman in need." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Ingrid was telling her that Eirik had been married before, that his wife was dead, that bringing women to his home was not something he did lightly. It was both reassurance and warning. "What was she like?" Brynhild asked. Ingrid's expression softened with memory. "Beautiful, kind. She had a way of making people feel valued. Servants, warriors, even the dogs all loved her. The Lord has never been the same since she passed. Until today, I had begun to think he never would be." After Ingrid left, Brynhild washed slowly, savoring the luxury of warm water and soap that smelled of lavender. The bronze mirror showed her a woman she barely recognized then, yes, but with clear eyes and skin that responded gratefully to proper care. The green dress fit well, and the embroidered details suggested skilled needlework and considerable expense. When she emerged from the chamber, the main hall had been transformed for the evening meal. Trestle tables filled the space, crowded with farmhands, craftsmen, and servants. At the high table on the dais, Eirik sat in a carved wooden chair that managed to suggest authority without ostentation. He wore a clean tunic of deep blue wool with silver brooch at the shoulders, clearly his finest clothes, but still practical rather than ornate. He rose when he saw her, and conversations throughout the hall gradually stilled as others noticed his attention. Brynhild felt dozens of eyes assessing her, measuring the green dress against the woman wearing it, trying to understand what her presence here meant. "You look well," Eirik said simply, gesturing to the chair beside his own, the seat of honor. Brynhild understood the significance immediately. By placing her at his right hand, Eirik was making a statement about her status in his household. Not a servant, not a guest, but something approaching an equal dot as they ate roasted pork, fresh bread, ale that tasted of honey and herbs. Eirik drew her into conversation about the day's events. He asked her opinion about the dispute between Magnus and Bjorn, about the best way to handle such conflicts, about her observations of the farmstead. "You have an unusual perspective," he said over the buzz of conversation from the lower tables. "Most people see what they expect to see. You see what's actually there." "Perhaps because I've spent so much time being invisible," Brynhild replied. "When people don't notice you, you learn to notice them." "And what do you notice about my people?" She considered this carefully. Throughout the meal, she had been watching the interactions around them. "They respect you, but they're not afraid of you. That's rare. Most men inspire one or the other, but seldom both. Your Smith Bjorn is proud, but not arrogant. He accepted correction because he trusts your judgment. Magnus will work twice as hard as necessary because you gave him a second chance when no one else would. Ingrid manages your household like her own because you've earned her loyalty, not just commanded it." Eirik nodded slowly. "Anything else?" "They're curious about me, but not hostile. They're waiting to see what role I'll play here before they decide how to treat me. That suggests they trust your choices, but think for themselves." She paused, meeting his eyes. "It's a good place you've built here." "I've been building it for 20 years, he said. "Since I returned from my last raiding voyage with enough silver to buy this land. But I've been building it alone." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Around the hall, The evening's conversations continued discussions of tomorrow's work. Gentle disputes about the best way to preserve meat for winter. Stories of the day's small victories and defeats. The sounds of a community that functioned well. But Brynhild could sense the truth beneath Eirik's observation. For all its prosperity and good management, the farmstead felt incomplete somehow. After the meal, as servants cleared the tables and the hall gradually emptied, Magnus approached their table with obvious nervousness. "My lord," he said, his voice still hoarse from the day's exertion, "I wanted to thank you for your fairness today." "Thank her," Eirik said, nodding toward Brynhild. "Her words carried more weight than my judgment." Magnus turned to her, his young face earnest with gratitude. "Lady Brynhild, I don't know why you spoke for me. I swear I'll prove worthy of your faith." "You already have," she said gently. "You fought with honor, accepted defeat with grace, and thanked those who helped you. Your father would be proud." As Magnus retreated, clearly overcome with emotion, Eirik studied Brynhild with renewed interest. "You do that easily, give people what they need to hear. Only when it's true." She gestured around the hall, where the last few diners were finishing their ale by lamplight. "This is a good place, filled with good people. But you're right that something's missing." "And what would that be?" "Joy," she said without hesitation. "Everyone here works hard, eats well, sleeps safely. But when did you last hear laughter that wasn't forced? When did you last see someone smile because they couldn't help themselves rather than because courtesy demanded it?" Eirik was quiet for a long moment. "Joy is a luxury I stopped allowing myself years ago." "Because of your wife? Because of my failures?" His voice carried old pain, carefully controlled. "Astrid died because I couldn't protect her. Our child died because I wasn't here when the fever came. Joy feels like betrayal of their memory." Brynhild reached across the table and touched his hand, a gesture that would have been impossibly forward a day ago, but now felt natural. "Guilt is not the same as love," she said softly. "And grief that never heals serves no one, not the living, not the dead." He didn't pull away from her touch, but she could feel the tension in his fingers. "You speak like someone who understands." "I speak like someone who has spent 4 months learning the difference between honoring the dead and burying yourself with them, around them." The hall had grown quiet except for the crackling of the central fire. The last servants had departed for their own quarters, leaving them alone with the shadows and the gradually dying light. "Stay," Eirik said quietly. "Not as my guest, but as what?" "As what?" "I don't know yet. But stay until we figure it out." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Brynhild with its naturalness. She woke each morning in the blue chamber, to the sound of activity beginning throughout the farmstead, the lowing of cattle, the ring of Bjarn's hammer, the voices of workers discussing the day's tasks. After so many months of waking to silence and emptiness, these sounds felt like music. She had found her place in the household's daily life without formal arrangement or discussion. Ingrid had quietly begun including her in the management of domestic affairs, asking her opinion about meals, involving her in decisions about the servants' schedules, consulting her about the best use of stored grain and preserved foods. Brynhild's years as a fisherman's wife had taught her to stretch resources and manage households efficiently, skills that proved valuable even in a place of relative abundance. But it was in the evenings that her true contribution emerged. After the day's work ended and the hall filled for the communal meal, Brynhild had begun telling stories that had started accidentally. Young Magnus had been struggling with nightmares since the confrontation with barn dreams, where his father appeared as various figures. Sometimes heroic, sometimes shameful, always demanding explanations Magnus couldn't provide. One evening, seeing his exhausted face across the hall, Brynhild had begun recounting tales of heroic fathers and the sons, who honored their memory through their own deeds. The hall had grown quiet as she spoke, her voice carrying easily over the usual dinner conversation. She wove together elements from half-remembered sagas, fragments of stories Gunnar had told her, and her own instinctive understanding of what her listeners needed to hear. Heroes who overcame doubt, young men who proved themselves through perseverance rather than single moments of glory. Fathers whose true legacy lay not in how they died, but in what they taught their children about living. The response had been immediate and profound. Magnus visibly relaxed as the story progressed, his shoulders losing their perpetual tension. But more than that, the entire hall seemed to settle into a different mood. People stopped their side conversations to listen. Servants paused in their clearing to hear the tale's conclusion. Even Eirik, who had initially watched her storytelling with careful neutrality, found himself drawn into the narratives. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Brynhild would gauge the mood of the hall, identify the undercurrents of concern or conflict that ran beneath the day's routine, and craft stories that addressed those needs indirectly. Tales of loyalty when disputes arose between workers. Stories of patience and perseverance during the hardest days of winter preparation. Sagas of love and loss that helped people process their own griefs without having to speak them aloud. The carved wooden storyteller's staff had appeared on the fourth evening, placed beside her chair without ceremony or explanation. It was beautiful work, old oak polished smooth by generations of hands, carved with intricate knotwork that seemed to shift in the firelight. The head of the staff was shaped like a raven, wings outstretched, eyes inlaid with chips of amber that seemed to glow with inner fire. "Where did this come from?" she had asked Eirik quietly. "It belonged to my grandfather's skald," he replied. "It's been gathering dust in my private chambers for 20 years. I thought it should be used again." The staff transformed her storytelling from casual entertainment to something approaching ritual. When she lifted it and the hall grew quiet, everyone understood that what followed would be more than mere words. The stories became performances, her voice modulating to match different characters, her gestures painting scenes in the air that her listeners could almost see. But the staff also marked her transformation in ways that went beyond storytelling. By giving it to her, Eirik had officially recognized her role in his household. She was no longer a guest or charity case, but the Famstead Skalda, position of respect and influence that few women had ever held. The change in how others treated her was immediate and striking. Servants who had been politely distant began asking her advice about personal matters. Workers sought her out to help resolve disputes before taking them to Eirik. Even beyond, initially skeptical of women involving themselves in men's affairs, had come to value her counsel after she helped him understand Magnus's perspective and find ways to channel the young man's eager energy productively. "You've given them something they didn't know they were missing," Eirik observed one evening as they walked the boundaries of his land together. It had become their custom to take these walks after dinner, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the companionable silence. Stories? Purpose beyond survival. He gestured toward the farmstead below them, where lamplight glowed from windows and smoke rose from chimneys. "When I built this place, I focused on making it prosperous and secure. I gave people good work, fair pay, safe shelter, but I never thought about what would make them want to stay beyond mere necessity. And now they do? Now they have something to belong to rather than just something to work for. Your stories give them heroes to emulate, values to embrace, reasons to see themselves as part of something larger than their individual struggles." They had reached the top of the ridge that overlooked the valley. Below them, the farmstead spread out like a village of light against the darkness. Beyond, the distant glow on the horizon marked where Skarnholt lay close enough to reach in a day's ride, far enough away to feel like another world entirely. "I received word from the village today," Eirik said quietly. Brynhild felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of word?" "Old Thormund sent his nephew with a message. The village council has been discussing your situation. They're concerned about the propriety of your living arrangements here. Concerned enough to do what? Concerned enough to suggest that you return to accept the offer of a place in Thormund's brother's household. As a serving woman, of course. For the sake of your reputation and the village's moral standards. The audacity of it struck Brynhild like a physical blow. For months, they had been content to let her freeze and starve rather than spend effort or resources helping her. Now that she had found security and purpose elsewhere, they suddenly cared about her welfare and reputation. And what did you tell his nephew? I told him that your living arrangements were none of the village's concern, and that any future messages of that nature would be considered insults requiring satisfaction. Eirik's voice carried the cold edge that appeared whenever he discussed matters of honor and respect. But the message itself troubles me less than what it represents, which is fear. You found a place here, gained influence and respect. That makes the village council nervous. A woman who was supposed to disappear quietly into poverty has instead become someone of importance. It challenges their assumptions about natural order. Brynhild understood the implications immediately. The village's intervention was not really about her welfare or reputation. It was about power specifically, about their discomfort with her having found some. As long as she had been helpless, they could afford to ignore her. But a woman who commanded respect, who held a position of influence in a wealthy household, who had the protection of a warrior like Eirik, such a woman might give other women ideas about their own possibilities. They'll try again, she said. Undoubtedly, but next time they'll use different tactics. More pressure, perhaps attempts to undermine your position here. Maybe even appeals to higher authorities about the scandal of unwed people living together. Are you concerned about the scandal? Eirik turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the moonlight. I'm concerned about you. This place, this life we're building, it's fragile. Reputation matters in ways that go beyond village gossip. If enough people believe we're living in sin, it could affect trade relationships, political alliances, my standing among other warriors. Not everyone is as independent as I try to be. The weight of what he was saying settled between them. Her presence here, her growing importance to the household, was creating complications she hadn't anticipated. By finding her place and her purpose, she had also made herself a target for those who preferred women to remain powerless. What do you want me to do? She asked. I want you to stay, he said without hesitation. But I also want you to understand the costs. If you remain here, you'll be choosing a life of constant challenge to the way things are supposed to be. Some battles we can win through strength and stubbornness. Others require more subtle strategies, such as making our arrangements so obviously beneficial to everyone involved that even our critics can't argue against it, or finding ways to formalize your position here that satisfy conventional expectations while preserving your actual independence. As they walked back toward the farmstead, Brynhild felt the staff in her hand differently than before. It was no longer just a symbol of her role as storyteller. It had become a weapon in a larger conflict, one that would determine not just her own fate, but the possibilities available to other women who might dare to step outside the narrow role society had prepared for them. The first real test of their resolve came 3 weeks later. On a gray morning when frost turned the world silver and the air carried the promise of snow, Brynhild was working in the herb garden, gathering the last of the winter sage before the coming storm, when she heard horses approaching at speed. From the direction of Skarnholt came a party of riders, 6 men in good cloaks and well-maintained weapons. At their head rode Jarl Olafsson, the regional lord who held authority over both Eirik's farmstead and the village below. Brynhild recognized him by reputation, a man in his 50s who had earned his position through political cunning rather than battlefield prowess. Known for his careful attention to law and custom, Eirik emerged from the stable where he had been inspecting a lame horse, his expression shifting to formal courtesy as he recognized his visitors. Jarl Olafsson, he called, striding forward to greet them properly. "Welcome to my hall, Eirik Ironburn." The Jarl dismounted with the careful precision of someone whose joints protested such activities. "I come on official business, I'm afraid." Brynhild remained among her herbs, close enough to listen, but far enough away to avoid drawing immediate attention. The wicker basket she carried gave her legitimate reason to be working in the garden, though her real purpose was to witness whatever confrontation was developing. Official business? Eirik's tone remained neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Complaints have been brought to my attention regarding the moral standards of your household," Jarl Olafsson said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of someone delivering prepared statements. "Specifically, regarding your unmarried cohabitation with the widow Brynhild, Eirik's daughter." "I see. And who has brought these complaints?" "The village council of Skarnholt, supported by testimony from several respected citizens. They express concern for the woman's reputation and worry that such arrangements set dangerous precedents for other women in the region." Eirik nodded slowly. "And what remedy do these concerned citizens propose?" "That the woman be returned to appropriate guardianship within the village, where her moral welfare can be properly supervised. Thormund Greybeard has generously offered to accept responsibility for her, providing suitable work and shelter within his brother's household." Brynhild felt her hands clench around the basket handle. She had expected this confrontation, but hearing it spoken aloud in such formal terms made her realize how little control she had over the situation. In the eyes of the law, she was still property to be assigned and reassigned according to the convenience of men. "I understand the council's concerns," Eirik said carefully, "but I believe they misunderstand the nature of Brynhild's position here. She serves as my household skald, a recognized and honored role that carries both responsibility and independence." "A skald?" One of the Jarl's companions, a younger man with the soft hands of someone who had never done physical labor, laughed outright. "Since when do women serve as skalds?" "Since they prove themselves capable of the work," Eirik replied, his voice carrying just enough edge to suggest the man should reconsider his tone. "Jarl." Olafsson held up a hand to forestall further comment from his follower. "The position of skald is indeed honored," he acknowledged. "But traditionally, many things were done differently," Eirik interrupted smoothly. "Traditionally, women couldn't own property, yet the law recognizes widows' rights. Traditionally, thralls couldn't earn freedom, yet manumission is legal and accepted. Tradition serves us when it promotes order and justice, but it binds us when it prevents adaptation to new circumstances." The Jarl studied Eirik with the calculating expression of someone reassessing a political situation. "You speak of law and custom as if they were negotiable. Some would call that dangerous thinking. I speak of them as tools for building strong communities, rather than chains for preserving weak ones. My famstead prospers. My people are loyal and content. Crime is virtually unknown here. If unconventional arrangements produce conventional results, where is the harm?" It was a careful argument. Brynhild realized one that appealed to practical results rather than abstract principles. Eirik was positioning her presence not as a challenge to moral order, but as an example of successful innovation. "Nevertheless," the Jarl continued, "appearances matter. Perception shapes reality in ways that go beyond individual households. If word spreads that moral standards are relaxing under my authority, it could affect relationships with neighboring regions, trade agreements, even military alliances. I cannot ignore such considerations." "Nor would I ask you to," Eirik said. "But perhaps there are solutions that address both practical concerns and moral appearances." "Such as?" Eirik glanced toward the herb garden where Brynhild worked, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment. In that brief contact, she saw both apology and determination. He was about to propose something that would change their relationship fundamentally. "Marriage," he said simply. The word fell into the conversation like a stone dropped into still water. sending ripples through everything that followed. Brynhild felt her breath catch, though she couldn't say whether from surprise, relief, or something approaching panic. "You would marry the widow to legitimize her position?" the Jarl asked. "I would marry a woman I respect and value to formalize an arrangement that already exists in all but name. She manages my household, counsels my people, and provides services that improve everyone's lives. Making our partnership legal would simply acknowledge openly what we have already built together." The young man who had laughed earlier leaned forward in his saddle. "A marriage of convenience, then? Hardly the stuff of epic poetry." "Epic poetry rarely concerns itself with the practical business of building good lives," Eirik replied. "I prefer substance to drama." Jarl Olafsson dismounted and walked a few steps away from his companions, gesturing for Eirik to join him in private conversation. Brynhild watched them speak in low tones, occasionally glancing in her direction, their body language suggesting negotiation rather than confrontation. Finally, they returned to the waiting group. A wedding before the winter solstice would satisfy concerns about propriety, the Jarl announced. Witnessed by representatives from the village and my own household, conducted according to proper customs and laws. Such an arrangement would transform a potentially scandalous situation into a celebration of traditional values. "And if we refuse?" Eirik asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Then I would be forced to uphold the village council's request. The woman would return with us today to accept Thormund's guardianship." The ultimatum was delivered with regretful formality, but ultimatum it clearly was. Brynhild understood that her months of growing independence had come down to this moment. Accept marriage to Eirik or return to the servitude she had escaped. She stepped forward from the herb garden, basket still in hand, moving with the deliberate grace she had learned during her weeks as household skald. All eyes turned to her as she approached the group of men who were casually deciding her fate. "Before anyone speaks for me," she said clearly, "perhaps someone should ask what I want?" The Jarl looked startled by her direct address. In his experience, women in her position were spoken about rather than spoken to. "Very well," he said after a moment's hesitation. "What do you want, woman?" Brynhild looked around the circle of faces, some curious, some disapproving, some openly hostile to her presumption in speaking unbidden. Finally, her gaze settled on Eirik, whose expression remained carefully neutral while his eyes held depths of concern and something that might have been hope. "I want," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "to continue building something worthwhile with someone I trust. If that requires marriage to satisfy those who would otherwise destroy what we've created, then I accept that price." She paused, letting her words settle before adding, "But I want it understood that this marriage serves practical purposes rather than romantic ones. I will be wife in name and law, but partner in fact. I will not be owned, even by a good man." The young man snorted with amusement. Listen to her dictate terms as if she had choices in the matter. Eirik's hand moved to his sword, hilt so smoothly that the motion seemed casual rather than threatening. "She has the choices I give her," he said quietly, "and I give her all the choices that matter." In that moment, Brynhild understood something profound about the man who had rescued her from the snow. His proposal wasn't about possessing her or even protecting her reputation. It was about creating a framework within which she could continue to grow and contribute without constantly fighting for the right to exist. "Then, we are agreed?" the Jarl asked. "A wedding before solstice?" "Agreed," Eirik said. "Agreed," Brynhild echoed, surprising herself with how right the word felt as the Jarl and his party departed. Brynhild remained in the herb garden, ostensibly continuing her work while actually processing what had just occurred. She was going to marry Eirik Ironburn. Not from love, not from passion, but from mutual respect and shared purpose. It wasn't the marriage she had imagined as a young woman, but perhaps it was the marriage she needed as the woman she had become. Weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation that revealed as much about the farmstead's character as months of ordinary routine. What could have been a perfunctory ceremony designed merely to satisfy political necessity, instead, became an expression of the community that Eirik and Brynhild had been building together. Ingrid threw herself into the planning with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including herself. She had been managing the household for years without the prospect of a formal mistress, and the thought of a proper wedding celebration seemed to unlock stores of creativity and ambition that had long remained dormant. "We'll hold the feast in the main hall," she announced one morning, consulting lists she had been compiling since the Jarl's visit. "But we'll need to expand the seating and proper decorations, not just functional arrangements, but something that speaks to the occasion's importance." Brynhild found herself caught between amusement and bewilderment at Ingrid's intensity. "It's just a legal formality," she pointed out gently. "We don't need to create a spectacle." "Nonsense," Ingrid replied firmly. "A wedding is never just a formality. It's a statement about what kind of community we are, how we honor our people, what we believe is worth celebrating. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly." The preparations became a project that involved everyone on the farmstead. Bjorn the smith began crafting decorative ironwork for the hall, elegant candle holders and serving, pieces that demonstrated skills beyond his usual functional work. Magnus, eager to contribute, volunteered to hunt for special game to grace the wedding feast. The weavers began producing new hangings in colors that complemented the season-deep reds and golds that would warm the hall against winter's advance. Even the question of Brynhild's wedding dress became a community endeavor. Astrid's finest gowns were examined and discussed, but ultimately deemed inappropriate, too much a reminder of past tragedy, too loaded with memories that belonged to someone else's story. Instead, the women of the household began creating something new, working together in the evenings after their regular tasks were completed. They designed and sewed a dress that reflected Brynhild's own style and preferences. Deep blue wool, the color of winter twilight, with silver embroidery that caught firelight like stars. The design was elegant but not ostentatious, beautiful but not frivolous, a garment that spoke to dignity and purpose rather than mere decoration. As Brynhild sat with the other women during these sewing sessions, she began to understand something she hadn't expected about her place in this community. She had thought of herself as an outsider who had been granted acceptance through Eirik's protection. But the women working beside her, Ingrid, the younger servants, even the wives of some of the farmhands, treated her as one of their own. Not as an interloper who needed to prove herself, but as someone whose contributions were already valued and whose happiness mattered to them personally. "You've given us something to be proud of," said Helga, one of the older servants, as she worked on the dress's intricate neckline. "Before you came, we were just workers in a well-run household. Now we're part of something that people talk about, something worth imitating." "What do you mean?" "The other farmsteads in the region, they're watching what happens here. How a household can function with a woman in a position of real authority. How people can prosper when everyone's contributions are valued rather than just the Lord's commands followed. You and the Master, you're showing them a different way of doing things." It was a perspective Brynhild hadn't considered. She had been focused on her own transformation and her growing relationship with Eirik, but she hadn't thought about how their arrangement might influence others. The idea that their example might inspire change elsewhere was both thrilling and daunting. Meanwhile, Eirik had his own preparations to manage. As word of the wedding spread through the region, responses began arriving from neighboring lords, successful merchants, and political allies. Some sent congratulations and requests to attend the ceremony. Others sent more pointed messages questioning the wisdom of elevating a woman of uncertain lineage to such a prominent position. "Listen to this," Eirik said one evening, reading from a letter that had arrived that day. "Jarl Magnusson, writes to express his concern about the precedent of warriors marrying above their station and women forgetting their proper place in the natural order. He suggests that such arrangements could lead to instability and moral confusion among the lower classes. Marrying above my station? Brynhild repeated, incredulous. I'm a fisherman's widow with no property and no family connections. How exactly am I above anyone's station? That's not what he means, and you know it. Eirik set the letter aside with obvious disgust. He means that you've claimed a position of influence and authority that women aren't supposed to have. The fact that you've earned it through your own abilities, rather than inheriting it through birth, makes it more threatening, not less. And what do you plan to do about his concerns? Nothing. Magnusson has always been more interested in preserving his own comfort than building anything worthwhile. His opinion matters less than the loyalty of my own people. He looked around the hall, where preparations for the wedding continued under Ingrid's enthusiastic direction. Besides, the results speak for themselves. This place has never been more prosperous or more harmonious. But the external pressures were creating internal tensions as well. Not everyone on the farmstead was entirely comfortable with the changes that Brynhild's presence had brought. A few of the older workers grumbled about women overstepping boundaries. Some worried that the Lord's marriage to someone of modest origins would somehow diminish their own status in the broader community. The most serious challenge came from Orm, Eirik's second in command and the man responsible for training the farmstead's warriors. He had served Eirik faithfully for over a decade, and his loyalty was unquestioned, but he struggled with the implications of the changing household dynamics. I'm not questioning your judgment, my lord, he said during one of their private conversations that Brynhild happened to overhear. But the men are asking questions I don't know how to answer. If a woman can rise to such prominence through storytelling and household management, what does that mean for those of us whose value lies in more traditional skills? It means, Eirik replied patiently, that value comes in many forms, and we're stronger when we recognize all of them rather than just the ones we're familiar with. Brynhild doesn't diminish your importance, Orm. She adds to it. But the other warriors, the ones from neighboring holds, they're laughing about how Eirik Ironborn has been tamed by a village widow. They say you've gone soft. That marriage has made you forget what real strength looks like. Brynhild felt her heart sink as she heard this. She had known their arrangement would create gossip, but she hadn't fully considered how it might affect Eirik's reputation among other warriors. In their world, a man's standing was largely determined by how other men perceived his strength and independence. If their marriage made him appear weak or manipulated, it could have consequences far beyond their personal relationship. That evening, as they took their customary walk around the farmstead's boundaries, she raised her concerns directly. Orm is worried about your reputation among other warriors, she said without preamble. I heard. And does that worry you? Eirik was quiet for a long moment, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. It concerns me, he said finally. Not because I doubt the rightness of what we're doing, but because reputation has practical consequences. If enough people believe I've been weakened by our arrangement, it could affect alliances, trade relationships, even our security if others decide we've become vulnerable. Then, perhaps we should reconsider. No. His voice was firm, cutting off her suggestion before she could complete it. I won't let fear of other people's opinions dictate how we live. But I also can't ignore the reality that perception matters in ways beyond our personal happiness. What do you suggest? That we prove them wrong, not through words or explanations, but through results. Let them see that this household is stronger, not weaker, for the choices we've made. Let them witness what we can accomplish together that neither of us could achieve alone. As they approached the crest of the hill that overlooked the valley, Brynhild felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Their wedding was no longer just about their own future. It had become a test of whether unconventional arrangements could succeed in a world that preferred traditional certainties. Below them, the farmstead glowed with warm light, the sounds of preparation and celebration drifting up through the cold air. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as partners who had chosen each other not from passion but from respect, not from need but from recognition of shared strength. The revelation came 3 days before the wedding, delivered by a messenger who arrived at dawn with news that changed everything. Brynhild thought she knew about herself. She was in the kitchen with Ingrid, reviewing final preparations for the wedding feast, when the commotion began outside. Shouts from the gate, the sound of horses, voices raised in urgent conversation. Through the window, she could see Eirik striding toward the main entrance, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock as he listened to whatever the messenger was telling him. "Stay here," Ingrid said, moving toward the door with the protective instincts of someone who had learned to shield the household from unwelcome surprises. But Brynhild was already following, drawn by an inexplicable certainty that whatever news had arrived concerned her directly. She reached the hall just as Eirik entered with a young man whose clothes and bearing marked him as someone accustomed to wealth and authority. "Brynhild," Eirik said, his voice carefully controlled. "This is Leif Erikson. He says he has information about your family." The young man stepped forward, studying her face with obvious recognition. Lady Brynhild. Or perhaps I should say, Lady Brynhild, Erik's daughter of the Westfjord holdings. The words hit her like physical blows. Westfjord, she knew that name. Everyone in the northern regions knew that name. The Westfjord holdings were among the richest in the known world, controlling trade routes that stretched from Ireland to Constantinople. The family that owned them was said to possess wealth beyond counting, influence that reached into royal courts, political power that shaped the fates of entire regions. "I don't understand," she said, though part of her was beginning to. "Your father was Eirik Magnusson, younger brother of my grandfather, Leif the Far-Traveled. When Eirik chose to leave the family holdings to make his own way as a simple fisherman, he was officially cast out, his name struck from family records, his inheritance forfeit. But blood remains blood, and family obligations endure even when family ties are severed." Brynhild felt the world tilting around her. Eirik Magnusson. She had always known her father's name was Eirik, but Erik's daughter simply meant Erik's daughter. It was common enough that she had never thought to question it. Her father had died when she was very young, and her mother had rarely spoken of his past beyond saying that he had chosen love over ambition. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because my grandfather is dying," Leif said simply. "And because the succession is in dispute. There are no direct male heirs. My father died in a raid 2 years ago, and I am his only child. But some of the family elders question my legitimacy, claim my mother was not properly married according to all necessary customs. They're trying to set aside my claim in favor of distant cousins whose bloodlines are less direct but more politically convenient. What does that have to do with me? Your existence proves that Eirik Magnusson's line continues. Under family law, even though your father was cast out, his bloodline retains certain rights. If you were to acknowledge your heritage and support my claim to leadership, it would strengthen my position considerably. The elders couldn't argue that the family line has died out if Erik's daughter stands beside me." Eirik moved closer to Brynhild, his presence both protective and supportive. "And in return, Lady Brynhild would be acknowledged as a true member of the Westfjord family, with all the rights and privileges that entails. Lands, income, political standing, everything that should have been hers by birth." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a forge, visible, substantial, potentially transformative. Brynhild tried to process what she was hearing. Wealth beyond her wildest dreams, political influence that could protect her from village councils and disapproving lords, social standing that would make her marriage to Eirik seemed like a fortunate alliance rather than charity extended to a powerless widow. "There's more," Leif continued, producing a leather scroll from his traveling pack. "Proof of your lineage. Documents my grandfather preserved despite the official exile. Letters your father wrote to family members in the years after he left. Even a description of the silver brooch he gave your mother as a wedding gift, the one you wear now." Brynhild's hand moved instinctively to her throat, where her mother's brooch rested beneath her dress. She had always treasured it as her only connection to parents who had died too young to tell her their full story. Now it seemed that story was far more complex than she had ever imagined. "Why didn't my father ever speak of this?" she asked. "Because he was a man of principle who chose love over duty, simplicity over wealth. From what the letters suggest, he never regretted his choice. But he also never forgot his family obligations entirely. Some of these documents indicate he expected that someday his children might have need of their true heritage." Eirik spoke into the silence that followed. "This is a remarkable offer, Leif Erikson. But surely you understand that such momentous news requires time for consideration. The wedding is set for 3 days hence. Our guests have already begun arriving. The legal arrangements have been made." "Of course," Leif replied smoothly, "but perhaps the timing is not coincidental. A marriage between Eirik Ironburn and a woman of the West Fjord bloodline would be a very different political arrangement than a marriage between a warrior and a village widow. The alliance possibilities alone—" "Stop." Brynhild's voice cut through his words with unexpected sharpness. "You speak of me as if I were a commodity to be traded, rather than a person making choices about her own life." Leif looked genuinely surprised by her interruption. "I meant no disrespect, lady. But surely you understand that your heritage changes your circumstances considerably. You have obligations now that go beyond personal preferences. I have obligations to myself and to people who have earned my loyalty through their actions rather than their bloodlines. My circumstances may have changed, but my values have not." It was a brave response, but even as she spoke the words, Brynhild felt their weight. The revelation of her true parentage did change things, whether she wanted to acknowledge it or not. The power that came with Westfjord connections could protect not just herself, but everyone she cared about. Eirik's farmstead, the people who had welcomed her, the community they were building together, all of it could benefit from the political influence and wealth she could now claim, but accepting that heritage would also mean accepting the obligations that came with it, supporting Leif's political claims, involving herself in family disputes that had nothing to do with the life she had chosen, becoming part of a world where marriages were strategic alliances and personal happiness was subordinated to political necessity. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course. I'll be staying at the inn in Skarnholt until after your wedding. Whatever you decide, the offer remains open, but I hope you'll consider not just what's best for yourself, but what's best for the family line that runs in your veins." After Leif departed, Brynhild found herself sitting in the blue chamber, staring at the bronze mirror that had become such a symbol of her transformation. The face looking back at her was the same one she had been seeing for weeks, clear-eyed, healthy, confident. But somehow it seemed different now, as if the knowledge of her heritage had changed not just how she thought about herself, but how she appeared in the world. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. "Come," she called. Eirik entered, moving with the careful courtesy of someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "How are you managing this?" "I'm not sure I am managing it," she replied honestly. "This morning, I was a fisherman's widow preparing to marry for practical reasons. Now I'm apparently the lost heir to one of the most powerful families in the known world. It's difficult to reconcile. The practical reasons for our marriage haven't changed," he pointed out gently. "Neither has the partnership we've been building. Your bloodline doesn't alter the work you've done here or the respect you've earned, doesn't it? If I'm truly a member of the Westfjord family, then our marriage becomes something different. Not just a strategic alliance to protect my independence, but a political union that could affect trade routes, military alliances, perhaps even royal successions. The stakes become much larger. And does that frighten you? Brynhild considered the question carefully. It terrifies me, she said finally. Not the responsibility itself, but the possibility that accepting it might require me to become someone different. The woman who told stories in your hall, who helped Magnus find his confidence, who learned to see her own worth. What if that woman gets lost in Lady Brynhild of the Westfjord holdings? Eirik moved closer, settling into the chair beside her bed. Then we make sure she doesn't get lost. Whatever you decide about your heritage, whatever claims you choose to acknowledge or reject, the woman I asked to marry is the one sitting here now. That doesn't change because we discover your father was a prince instead of a fisherman. And if my political obligations conflict with our personal choices, then we find ways to honor both, or we choose the ones that align with our values rather than our advantages. His voice carried the steady certainty that had first drawn her to trust him. You've already proven you can wield influence responsibly. Greater influence just means greater opportunity to do good. As evening approached and the sounds of wedding preparation continued throughout the farmstead, Brynhild realized that her choice was not really between poverty and wealth, or between independence and obligation. It was between the person she had been becoming and the person others expected her to become now that they knew her true heritage. The question was whether she could claim her birthright while remaining true to the values she had discovered in herself during these months of growth and change. The wedding morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that made every surface seem to shine with inner fire. Brynhild woke before the servants stirred, her mind already racing with the weight of decisions that could not be delayed much longer. She had spent the previous 2 days wrestling with Leif's revelation, turning the implications over in her mind like a smith examining metal for flaws. The political advantages were undeniable: wealth, influence, protection, not just for herself, but for everyone at the farmstead. The family obligations were equally clear, supporting Leif's claim, involving herself in succession disputes, accepting responsibilities that stretched far beyond the valley where she had found her peace. But it was the personal cost that troubled her most. Not the risk of failure or political entanglement, but the possibility that claiming her birthright might somehow diminish the woman she had become through struggle and choice rather than inheritance and privilege. Ingrid knocked softly and entered with a tray of bread, cheese, and honey wine. "The other women are ready to help you dress," she said, setting the tray beside the bed. "But first, you should eat. It's going to be a long day." "Ingrid," Brynhild said, accepting the offered cup, "if you discovered something that could change your entire life, something that offered great advantages but required great sacrifices, how would you decide what to do?" The older woman settled into the chair by the window, her expression thoughtful. "I suppose I would ask myself what kind of person I wanted to be at the end of my life. Rich or poor, powerful or simple, those are circumstances that can change. But who you are in your heart, how you treat the people who depend on you, whether you remain true to your own values, those choices define you in ways that outlast everything else. And if the circumstances can help you protect the people you care about, then the choice becomes more complex. But I've learned that protection built on compromising your principles usually crumbles when you need it most. Better to face dangers as yourself than to face them as someone you've pretended to be." Before Brynhild could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see riders approaching the farmstead at speed, not the dignified procession of wedding guests, but the urgent pace of people bearing important news. Eirik emerged from the main hall, still in his sleeping clothes, but with his sword at his side. The lead rider dismounted and spoke rapidly, his words too distant to make out, but his gestures urgent and alarming. Whatever message he carried, it transformed Eirik's expression from curiosity to grim concern. Within minutes, a servant knocked at Brynhild's door with a request for her immediate presence in the hall. She dressed quickly in her ordinary clothes and hurried downstairs to find Eirik conferring with 3 messengers whose travel-stained appearance suggested they had ridden through the night. "What's happened?" she asked. "Raiders," Eirik replied tersely. "A large force, well organized, moving along the coast. They struck 2 settlements yesterday, burned the buildings, took captives, killed anyone who resisted. They're heading this direction." One of the messengers, a young man with a bandaged arm, stepped forward. "My lord, they're not ordinary raiders. They're too disciplined, too well-equipped. Someone's organizing them, providing leadership and resources far beyond what scattered warbands usually possess." "How many?" Eirik asked. "At least 60 men, possibly more. They have proper siege equipment, ladders, grapples, even a small catapult. This isn't a raid for quick plunder. They're preparing to take fortified positions." Brynhild felt ice forming in her stomach. 60 trained warriors with siege equipment could overwhelm even a well-defended farmstead. Eirik had perhaps 20 men capable of fighting, plus whatever weapons and fortifications he had prepared for such emergencies. "How long do we have?" she asked. "They were 15 miles south yesterday evening," the messenger replied. "If they move at normal pace, they'll reach Skarnholt by midday. Here by late afternoon." The timing was devastating. Wedding guests had been arriving since yesterday, elderly relatives, neighboring families, even some of the women and children from Skarnholt village who had come to witness the ceremony. Instead of extra defenders, the farmstead was crowded with non-combatants who would need protection. "We need to evacuate the guests," Eirik said immediately. "Get them moving north toward Jarl Olafsson's stronghold. They'll have better defenses there." "What about the wedding?" Ingrid asked quietly. Eirik and Brynhild looked at each other across the hall. The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had anticipated when they woke that morning. Before either could answer, another voice cut through the discussion. Perhaps postponement would be premature. Everyone turned to see Leif Erikson entering the hall, fully dressed despite the early hour and moving with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. "You heard about the raiders?" Eirik asked. "I heard. I also took the liberty of sending messages to my men. I have 12 experienced warriors camped a few miles north. They were escorting me for security, but they can be here within the hour if needed." 12 additional warriors would significantly improve their defensive capabilities. But Brynhild understood immediately that Leif's offer came with strings attached. His presence here, his convenient arrival just before the wedding, even his knowledge of the approaching threat, none of it felt coincidental. "You knew this was coming," she said, not making it a question. Leif smiled, neither confirming nor denying her accusation. "I knew that certain political interests would prefer to prevent today's wedding from taking place. Raiders attacking just before the ceremony could be seen as terribly unfortunate timing or as a convenient way to disrupt arrangements that threaten established power." "Structures? You're saying someone hired them?" "I'm saying that 60 organized warriors don't appear by accident, especially not with siege equipment and detailed knowledge of local defenses. Someone with considerable resources wanted to ensure this wedding didn't happen." The implications hit Brynhild like thunderclaps. Their marriage had attracted more attention than they realized, attention from people powerful enough to organize private armies, people who saw their partnership as threatening enough to warrant violent intervention. "Why?" Eirik demanded. "Because what you've built here represents change that frightens those who profit from the current order," Leif replied. "A successful household where women hold real authority where merit matters more than bloodline, where prosperity comes from cooperation rather than domination. Such examples have a way of spreading. Better to destroy the example before it inspires too many imitators. Brynhild felt the pieces falling into place. The village council's complaints, the Jarl's concerns about precedent, the neighboring lord's disapproval, all of it had been building toward this moment. Their quiet revolution and domestic arrangements had been noticed by people with the power to stop it. "And your convenient offer of help?" Eirik asked suspiciously. "Serves my interests as well as yours. If Lady Brynhild acknowledges her Westfjord heritage and we formalize an alliance through your marriage, then attacking this farmstead becomes an attack on the Westfjord holdings. Very few enemies are prepared to face those consequences." It was a masterful political maneuver, Brynhild realized. Leif had let the threat develop until they were desperate enough to accept his terms, then positioned himself as their savior. Whether he had orchestrated the raiders' attack or simply anticipated it, the result was the same. Her choice about claiming her heritage was being made under duress. So our options are surrendered to the raiders. Fight them with insufficient forces, or accept your protection in exchange for political alliance, she asked. Those appear to be the choices, yes. Eirik moved to stand beside her, his presence both supportive and defiant. There's a fourth option. We fight with the forces we have and trust in our own strength rather than political maneuvering. That's not just brave, it's suicidal, Leif pointed out reasonably. 60 trained warriors against your 20? Even with the advantage of fortification, your chances are minimal. But they would be our chances. One on our own terms. Brynhild looked around the hall, where she had told so many stories, where she had found her voice and her purpose. The wedding dress hung ready in her chamber upstairs, created by willing hands, embroidered with symbols of hope and new beginnings. The storyteller's staff rested in its place by the hearth, polished and ready for whatever tales the day might bring. Everything she had built here, everything she had become, now hung in the balance. Accept her heritage and the protection it offered, but bind herself to political obligations she had never chosen. Reject it and fight for her independence, but risk everything and everyone she cared about. Outside, the sounds of preparation continued, guests departing for safety. Warriors checking weapons and defenses, servants securing valuables against the possibility of siege. The wedding that was supposed to celebrate their partnership had become the battlefield where they would discover whether that partnership could survive the forces arrayed against it. "How long do we have to decide?" she asked. "My men can be here in an hour," Leif replied. "The raiders will arrive by late afternoon. If you're going to accept Westfjord protection, the alliance needs to be formalized before they arrive, a marriage ceremony witnessed by my representatives, with clear acknowledgement of your heritage and our mutual obligations. And if we refuse, then I wish you well in your defense, but I cannot risk my men in a battle that serves no political purpose." The ultimatum was delivered with perfect courtesy, but ultimatum it clearly was. Brynhild understood that her months of growing independence had led to this moment, where she must choose between the authentic life she had built and the powerful life she could claim. But as she looked at Eirik, she realized that perhaps the choice was not really between authenticity and power. Perhaps it was between different ways of using the power she had always possessed, but only recently learned to recognize. "Give me a moment to think," she said, moving toward the hearth where her storyteller's staff waited as she lifted the familiar weight of carved oak. She felt something shift in her understanding. She had spent these months learning to tell stories that help people see themselves as heroes of their own lives. Now, it was time to discover what kind of hero she would choose to be in her own story. Brynhild stood in the center of the hall, the storyteller's staff gripped firmly in her hands, and felt the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. Around her, The assembled crowd weighted Eirik with his steady strength. Leif with his political calculations, the farmstead workers with their worried faces, even some of the wedding guests who had delayed their departure to witness whatever would unfold. "I have a story to tell," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "This is hardly the time for stories," Leif objected. "The raiders will be here in hours. Decisions must be made." "This is exactly the time for stories," Brynhild replied, lifting the staff higher. "Because stories are how we decide who we are when everything else is stripped away. And I've learned something important about stories during my time here. The best ones are true, even when the facts are complicated." She began to pace slowly around the hearth, her movements drawing every eye in the hall. Once there was a young woman who believed she was nothing more than the daughter of a poor fisherman. She married a good man, lived a simple life, expected nothing more than quiet happiness. When that happiness was taken from her, she thought her story had ended. The familiar rhythms of storytelling began to work their magic, creating the intimate connection between teller and audience that made even urgent matters pause for the power of narrative. But stories don't end when we think they do. They change direction. The woman discovered she was not who she thought she was, not powerless, not forgotten. She found her voice, her strength, her purpose. She learned that worth comes not from what others give you, but from what you choose to do with whatever gifts you possess. Leif shifted impatiently, but Eirik remained still, understanding that something crucial was happening here. Then one day, the woman discovered that her father had not been a poor fisherman, but a prince who chose love over wealth, simplicity over power. She learned that she could claim riches beyond imagining, influence beyond dreaming. All she had to do was accept that her true worth came from her bloodline rather than her choices. Brynhild stopped pacing and faced the assembled crowd directly. But here's what the woman realized. Claiming power you inherited is easy. Anyone can do that. Creating power through your own actions, earning respect through your own contributions, building something worthwhile through your own choices, that's what heroes do. "Lady Brynhild," Leif interjected, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "This is very poetic, but it doesn't change the reality of 60 armed raiders approaching our position. Your heritage can protect everyone in this hall. Your pride can only get them killed." "You misunderstand," she replied calmly. "This isn't about pride. This is about recognizing that some protections cost more than they're worth. You offer to save us in exchange for my accepting obligations to your political schemes. But what you're really asking is for me to become someone else, someone who owes her position to bloodline rather than merit. Someone whose power depends on family connections rather than personal strength." She gestured around the hall with the storyteller's staff. "Look at what we've built here. Not through inherited wealth or political maneuvering, but through work and wisdom and mutual respect. Every person in this hall has value not because of who their parents were, but because of what they contribute. That's worth defending. With what army?" Leif demanded. "You have 20 fighters against 60. That's not heroic determination. It's suicide. Perhaps you've underestimated what people will fight for when they're defending something they've helped create, rather than something they've merely inherited." Brynhild turned to face Eirik directly. "I've made my choice. I acknowledge my Westfjord heritage. My father's blood runs in my veins, and I'm proud of the man he was for choosing love over ambition. But I reject the obligations that come with claiming that heritage. I am Brynhild, Eirik's daughter, not because my father was a prince, but because I am the woman who learned to find strength in hardship, purpose in service, and hope in building something new." She moved to stand beside Eirik, her decision clear in every line of her body. "We marry today as planned, not because political necessity demands it, but because we choose to face whatever comes as partners. And if that means we fight impossible odds to defend what we've built, then that's the story we'll tell with our lives rather than our words." The silence that followed was broken by slow applause from an unexpected source. Magnus, clapping with the fervor of someone whose own transformation had been inspired by the woman now choosing courage over safety. "Well said, my lady," he called out. "Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are poor." One by one, others in the hall began to nod or voice agreement. Not all some faces showed fear or doubt, but enough to demonstrate that Brynhild's choice resonated with people who had found their own worth through struggle rather than inheritance. Leif studied the scene with the calculating expression of someone reassessing political realities. "You're certain of this decision?" "Once I withdraw my offer, it cannot be renewed." "I'm certain," Brynhild replied without hesitation. "Then I wish you well in your defense. My men and I will depart immediately. We have no interest in dying for other people's principles." As Leif strode from the hall, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet, Eirik moved closer to Brynhild. "Are you ready to get married?" he asked, his voice carrying both admiration and concern. "I'm ready to become who I'm meant to be," she replied, gripping the storyteller's staff like the weapon it had become. "Whether that includes a wedding ceremony or a funeral rite remains to be seen." The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike anything the northern regions had ever witnessed, a celebration held under the shadow of approaching battle, where vows were exchanged with weapons close at hand and love was declared in the face of possible death. Brynhild wore her blue wedding dress with a sword belt over it, the practical meeting the ceremonial in a way that perfectly captured the day's strange duality. Eirik stood beside her in his finest tunic with mail beneath it, looking every inch the warrior bridegroom prepared to defend his household with his life. The guests who remained were those who had chosen to stay and fight, rather than flee to safety workers who could have left but preferred to stand with the people who had treated them as family. Neighbors who valued loyalty over prudence. Even some of the older wedding guests who declared themselves too stubborn to let raiders dictate their schedules. Old Henrik, the village priest who had performed more wedding ceremonies than he could count, conducted the service with a gravity appropriate to the circumstances. But there was also joy, fierce, defiant joy that refused to be diminished by external threats. "Do you, Eirik Ironburn, take this woman to be your wife, to stand with her in prosperity and hardship, in peace and war, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Eirik replied, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Do you, Brynhild, Eirik's daughter, take this man to be your husband, to stand with him in prosperity and hardship, in peace and war, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," she answered, meaning it more deeply than she had expected. As they exchanged rings, simple silver bands that Bjarn had crafted in the smithy, Brynhild felt the weight of the storyteller's staff in her free hand. The ceremony was making her Eirik's wife in the eyes of law and custom, but the staff reminded her that she remained the author of her own story. "By the authority granted to me by God and custom, I pronounce you husband and wife," Henrik declared. "May your union bring strength to each other and blessings to all who depend upon you." The cheers that erupted from the assembled crowd were heartfelt but brief. Everyone knew that the real test of their vows would come within hours, when the raiders arrived to challenge everything they had built together. As if summoned by that thought, a horn sounded from the watchtower, long, urgent blasts that announced approaching danger. Through the hall's windows, they could see the sentry pointing south, where dust clouds marked the movement of many horses. "How much time?" Eirik called to the tower. "An hour, maybe less," came the shouted reply. The transformation that followed was swift but orderly. Wedding guests became defenders, arranging themselves according to previously discussed plans. Women and children moved to the most protected areas of the farmstead. Men checked weapons and took positions behind the wooden palisade that surrounded the main buildings. Brynhild found herself torn between competing impulses. Part of her wanted to retreat to safety with the other non-combatants, to trust in Eirik's military experience and the defenses he had prepared. But a larger part, the part that had learned to value her own voice and judgment, refused to be sidelined during the most crucial moment of their shared story. "I'm staying with you," she told Eirik as he made final preparations. "Brynhild, you're not trained for this. The safest place for me is wherever I can contribute most effectively," she interrupted. "I may not be a warrior, but I know these people. I know what motivates them, what they fear, what they need to hear to find courage when courage seems impossible." Eirik studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Stay close to me. If the defenses are breached, if things go badly, we face them together. That's what the vows meant, isn't it? In prosperity and hardship, in peace and war." As the raiders came into view, a disciplined force moving with the precision of professional soldiers, rather than random brigands, Brynhild climbed onto the raised platform where defenders could observe the approaching threat. She lifted the storyteller's staff high enough for everyone in the farmstead to see. "Listen to me," she called, her voice trained by months of holding the hall's attention during evening stories. "They come expecting to find frightened villagers and scattered defenders. Instead, they'll find people who fight not for gold or glory, but for something much more powerful, the right to live as we choose, to build what we value, to prove that worth comes from within rather than from what others grant us." She gestured toward the approaching raiders with the staff. "Those men serve masters who see us as threats to the old ways of doing things. They're right to be afraid. What we've built here, a place where everyone matters, where respect is earned rather than inherited, where strength comes from unity rather than domination, that is threatening to people whose power depends on others remaining powerless." Around the farmstead's defenses, she could see heads lifting, shoulders straightening. Her words were having the effect she intended, transforming a desperate defense into a principled stand. "Today we fight not just for our lives, but for the future we're creating. Today we prove that some things are worth any sacrifice. Today we show them what happens when ordinary people decide to become extraordinary." The raiders had arranged themselves in attack formation, their leaders studying the farmstead's defenses with professional interest. 60 men against 20, exactly as predicted. But numbers, Brynhild realized, were only part of the story. The question was which side would fight harder, those who served for pay, or those who fought for everything they had built together. "Remember," she called out as the first arrows began to fly, "we are the heroes of this story. And heroes never surrender when they're defending something worth saving." The battle that decided everything lasted only 3 hours. But in those hours, the true measure of what they had built together was revealed. The raiders came expecting frightened farmers and scattered resistance. Instead, they encountered something they had never faced before: people fighting not for survival, but for the right to define themselves. Every defender knew exactly what they were protecting, and why it mattered more than their individual safety. Magnus fought with the fury of someone proving his father's honor. Bjarne wielded his smith's hammer with devastating effect, each blow powered by the knowledge that defeat would mean losing the workshop where he had trained the next generation. Even the servants fought fiercely, defending not just their livelihoods, but the community where they had found dignity and purpose. But it was Brynhild who surprised everyone, including herself. Standing at Eirik's side throughout the battle, she used her voice as effectively as any weapon. When defenders wavered, she reminded them of their own strength. When courage failed, she told quick stories of their own past victories. When despair threatened, she painted word pictures of the future they were fighting to preserve. The turning point came when the Vonasuras, as the future they were fighting to preserve. The turning point came when the fighting to preserve Raiders' leader, a scarred veteran, who had clearly expected easy victory, found himself facing not just military resistance, but something he couldn't understand. These people weren't fighting like desperate defenders. They were fighting like owners of something precious, with the fierce joy of those who had found something worth dying for. "Retreat," he finally called to his men as the afternoon shadows lengthened. "This isn't worth the losses." As the raiders departed, leaving behind broken equipment and wounded men but no conquered farmstead, an exhausted cheer went up from the defenders. They had won not through superior numbers or better weapons, but through superior motivation. In the days that followed, word of the victory spread throughout the region faster than anyone had expected. The story grew with each telling, as stories do. But the core truth remained unchanged. A small community had successfully defended itself against overwhelming odds because its people had something worth fighting for. The wedding celebration that had been interrupted by battle was finally completed a week later, when the wounded had been tended and the damaged defenses repaired. This time, the guests included not just local well-wishers, but representatives from other communities who wanted to understand how such a defense had been possible. Brynhild found herself in the strange position of being consulted by other households about matters of organization and morale. Word had spread that she had somehow transformed ordinary workers into extraordinary defenders, and people wanted to know how such transformations could be achieved. "It's not magic," she explained to a delegation of village women who had come seeking advice. "People fight hardest when they're protecting something they helped create rather than something they simply inherited. Give people real voices in shaping their communities, and they'll find real courage when those communities are threatened." The principles that had guided their defense began to influence other farmsteads and villages throughout the region. Not overnight, and not without resistance from traditional authorities, but gradually and persistently. The example of what was possible when people were valued for their contributions rather than their bloodlines proved more powerful than any political manifesto. Jarl Olafsson, when he finally visited to assess the situation personally, found himself both impressed and troubled by what he witnessed. "You've created something remarkable here," he admitted to Eirik as they walked through the rebuilt farmstead. "Prosperity, loyalty, effective defense, everything a lord could want from his holdings. But you've also created something potentially destabilizing. Other women are beginning to ask why they couldn't hold positions of authority like your wife does. Other workers are questioning why their voices don't carry weight in decisions that affect their lives. And is that necessarily bad?" Brynhild asked, joining their conversation with the easy confidence that had replaced her earlier deference to male authority. "It's change," the Jarl replied carefully. "And change makes those in power nervous, especially when they can't control its direction or predict its consequences." "Then perhaps," Eirik suggested, "the answer is not to prevent change, but to guide it toward beneficial outcomes. What we've learned here could strengthen other communities rather than threaten them." 6 months after the wedding, Brynhild stood again on the hill overlooking the farmstead. But now she carried not just the storyteller's staff, but also a small bundle that contained the future in a different form, the child that would be born in spring. The next generation that would grow up seeing partnership and mutual respect as natural rather than revolutionary. "Regrets?" Eirik asked, moving to stand beside her as had become their evening custom. "About refusing my West Fjord heritage?" "None." She gestured toward the valley below, where lamplight glowed from windows and smoke rose from chimneys. "That wealth would have come with obligations to maintain systems I don't believe in. This wealth," she indicated their thriving community, "comes from creating systems I do believe in." "And the child will grow up here, learning these values?" "Learning to question values, to think for themselves, to understand that worth comes from what you do rather than who your parents were." She paused, one hand resting on her growing belly. Boy or girl, they'll know that courage comes in many forms, that leadership can be earned rather than inherited, and that the most powerful stories are the ones you write with your own life. As winter approached once again, the farmstead prepared with the confidence of people who had tested themselves and discovered their own strength. The storyteller's staff rested by the hearth each evening, ready to weave new tales of ordinary people choosing to become extraordinary. And in the village of Skarnholt below, other women began to wonder what might be possible if they too refused to accept that their stories had already been written by others. The revolution that Brynhild and Eirik had begun with 4 simple words, "Come home with me," continued to spread, one changed life at a time, proving that the most enduring transformations come not from force or inheritance, but from the quiet courage of people who dared to imagine better ways of living together. In the years that followed, bards would sing of the battle of the wedding day, when love conquered politics and community defeated conquest. But those who had lived it understood that the real victory was quieter and more lasting, the daily choice to build something worthy of defending, one relationship at a time.